Verb shifts, verb tense shifts, or verb aspect shifts, really, those are kind of hard to explain because they really depend on the situation, right? Every situation is different. So I can't just give you some rules for verb shifting or ways to avoid it that are going to work in every case, because a lot of times you want to shift verb tenses within one sentence so that you can show temporal relationships between ideas or things or events or whatever, right? So you do need to have tense shifts. Tense shifts are crucial, but they follow certain kinds of rules. But first, let's talk about where most students get dinged in essays for shifting tenses, and that is when you're analyzing literature or film or a poem, whatever. It doesn't matter what you're analyzing. Whatever you're analyzing that's literary needs to be written in the present tense. So the actions in the story you are relating in the present tense. So if you're writing a story about or you're writing an analysis of The Cask of Amontillado by Poe, you don't want to say, Montresor tied Fortunato up in the cavern, right? No. Montresor ties Fortunato up in the cavern as he blank, 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 right? So it's always present tense. You're always describing the events in the story as though they are in present tense. Now, sometimes the intro, in fact almost always, the intro and the conclusion are written in past tense because you're looking more like historically at the situation. But when you go to describe what's happening in the story, it is present tense, right? And then your analysis is also in present tense. So you're describing, what Montresor is doing to Fortunato, and then you say, this scene illustrates, right? Illustrates is the present tense. And so you're going to stay in the present tense as you're analyzing events in a story or a film or a poem or whatever as they are occurring in the present tense. Why? The reason for that is because literature, film, whatever, is eternal. There is no expiration date. There's no end to it, right? It's happening as you're reading it, and it's happening as you're analyzing it, whenever that happens to be in time, right? We talk about it as if it's ongoing, and so you need to speak of it as if it's, as if it's present, not ongoing. It's not progressive, right? It's present tense, just simple present, okay? And then if you need to use, the progressive tense or the future tense, that's okay too, but you want to stick in the present. And so most narratives, most stories, most poems, most whatever, right, essays, articles, nonfiction, literary nonfiction, are written in a specific tense. There's like a main tense, and then they switch tenses from that tense in a way that agrees. So let's look down here. I'm going to read from the document that I've shown you, which is basically from the Owl at Purdue. So there are situations where you want to kind of stick together, right? So it says present or past primary narration. Okay, so that's narration that happens from it's looking at it as though it has happened and it is over, right? Harry Potter is third person past narration primarily. So let's look at it real quick. I'll pull out just a random passage from here, and we'll see. I'm going to try to do one that it doesn't include dialogue, because dialogue is often present. It can switch, right? It can be past, present, future, progressive. It doesn't matter. Narration is different. It's in its own thing, and so that's dialogue, right? When the characters are speaking to each other. Okay, so Percy looked slightly abashed. Looked and abashed, right? Dumbledore left the hall, right? Past tense. Walking quickly and quietly. Now that is progressive, right? It describes the action as he left. So you can see that, that's the progressive right there that's being used. The present progressive. Snape stood for a moment, watching the headmaster with an expression of deep resentment on his face. Then he too left. So you can see how it's past, right? But it also shifts to progressive. And that's okay. Harry glanced sideways at Ron and Hermione. Glanced, right? Both of them had their eyes open too, reflecting, right? Progressive, the starry ceiling. What was all that about? Ron mouthed. Right? Mouthed, past. Okay, so you can see that there is a main tense, which is past, and then there are shifts in those tenses that are correct, okay? And so past perfect, right, for earlier time frames, or even progressive, okay? It depends on really how it's happening or what the action is in the story that will determine the tense. It shouldn't sound weird. One way that you can help yourself identify incorrect shifts in tense is by reading things aloud. And when you read things aloud, you're much more likely to hear it, right, with your ears than just in your brain hearing it, right? So you want to read it aloud to try to figure out if that tense is correct, if that shift is correct, okay? So let's see. Present primary narration, right, corresponds to present perfect. Future primary narration corresponds to future perfect, right? And so those are examples for the perfect tense, how you're going to use the tense, right? And that's pretty much the best that I can explain it. You've got a couple videos to watch, and then you have a couple of examples, and then that's really it. You kind of have to determine for yourself where the shifts are, and you should know that just by listening to it. When we hear about noon, the sky darkened, a breeze sprang up, and a low rumble announces the approaching storm, we hear that sounds weird, and we have to find the weirdness. So look at the verbs. Darkened, sprang up, and announces. Well, 2 of those are past, and 1 of those is present. So because the 2 are past, it's a good bet that the 3rd should be past too, right? About noon, the sky darkened, a breeze sprang up, and a low rumble announced the approaching storm. Now, you can do it in present tense, but then you'd have to change the about noon, because that implies something that has already happened, right? You'd want to say, at noon, the sky darkens, a breeze springs up, and a low rumble announces the approaching storm, right? Or now, the sky darkened, right? Anything that's indicating a present time frame, okay? So you just really need to look at some of those clues in the sentence, which are all the other verbs, right? Or even in the paragraph, all the verbs, and then where the deviations occur, and then read it aloud to see if the deviations sound like they should be there or they shouldn't be there. Because really it's about just how it sounds to us as native speakers. ELL speakers, or ELL students, have a more difficult time, just like we would have a more difficult time if we were reading in our second language rather than our first, the one that we've heard since children, and understand kind of what feels like internally or intrinsically why verbs shift and when they should shift. So just be, as correct as you can when you're trying to identify these shifts. And to do that most effectively, you need to read the passages aloud.